Hi, so I had my first lecture earlier on European philosophical traditions, and the module is, no, that's what the module is called, and then the subtitle is Knowledge, Truth, and Reality. What we studied today wasn't actually any of those three things, it was more like a contextual sort of lecture based on the society in ancient Greece and Athens around the time of Plato. And I think this was called the time of antiquity, if I'm not mistaken. So there was antiquity, uh, medieval, and then modernity. Okay, so, alright. So we looked into Plato. I've got some notes here with me as well because I'm not sure I can remember all of it and I don't want to get mixed up between my lectures. So we looked at Plato. Plato wrote a book called The Republic. But it wasn't actually called The Republic, that was basically the translation. Politica, Politicia, Respublica, and then we obviously changed that. Okay, right, so the better definition would be life in the state. So Plato was interested in, I guess, living the good life. And the good life wasn't just an individual sort of way of living, but it's also a way of living for the state. And another word for the state or society is polis. So the highest form of polis is Polis, and that's according to Plato in his Republic. And what Plato posited was a form of utopia, and utopia translates as no place. Okay, so that's interesting. But I guess he was trying to find the ideal, the form. Maybe he was assuming that there was a form of the ideal state, of the ideal world that we should live in, of the ideal society, right? And that's perhaps what the material world, so the physical world around us, the physical structure of society, is aiming towards, but it's not quite it, it's just a mere copy, a low resolution copy of what it actually could be, which is the utopia. But the utopia is the ultimate vision of perhaps what we should strive towards, but we can't actually get there. And I'm not sure if Plato ever thought that we could attain his sort of republic, his idea that, of his perfect society. Um, but he ended up talking about it anyway, which is interesting, and I think that does make sense to talk about it in the sense of forms, because the forms were perfect, things. They're the most real things, and everything else is simply just trying to get towards it. And I guess it's also acting in accordance with other forms, such as justice and beauty. And all of these have their place in the ideal society because the society is the world in which we live, congregating with other human beings. And then there's the world of the forms. I don't know. Okay, so there's a key word here. If everything in Polis was perfect, what would it look like? So that's a question we have to think about, basically. And that's a question that Plato also asked, which is what I was saying a minute ago. So that's what he wanted to, find out the ideal. Because he was interested in ideals, because he thought the ideals were the most real thing, the forms, because that's where our soul came from. Our soul came from the realm of ideals, or the realm of forms, or the realm of ideas. And that's where we find truth. So perhaps that's why Plato thought about the world in terms of utopia, of no place, because it's no physical place. Okay. And there's this keyword here, dikaio suno, and this means doing the right thing. And that's not just doing the right thing in terms of, I'm going to get it wrong. So it says here that it can be translated as justice, but not justice in the way that we understand the word. It was a different sort of justice for Plato. So we might understand the word justice as being referring to the legal system. People getting punished for doing bad things, people getting rewarded perhaps for doing good things, even though, Does that always really happen in the legal system? I'm not sure. But Plato's definition was much more broad. So I said a minute ago that Plato sees no difference between society and the individual. I'm not quite sure how that links to Plato. I mean, I'm not quite sure how that links to the dikaiosune, which is justice. Okay, so underneath justice, I've got written society and the individual, and I think that means because it's one, and I think it's because this is a justice that applies both to society and the individual equally. So, and also the individual and society are not really seen as distinct from one another, they're seen as the same thing. And I assume that that's seen as the same thing in Plato's Republic, in his Callipolis, because I can't see them being seen the same thing in reality in Greece. I don't know. Was the individual and society seen as the same in Greece? Or was there a distinction between the two and it's just Plato who sort of wished that they were seen as the same thing? And I guess in some ways it's a form of altruism, isn't it? It's about working for the higher good. You know, it's working for the good of society and sort of like almost neglecting the self. And that's interesting as well because it's about the birth of morality. Maybe not the birth of morality, but maybe the birth of the recognition of morality, right? So understanding that we live in a society with other beings and we also have to consider those beings when we're making our decisions because we can't just work for ourselves. And perhaps that's what Plato understood. Okay, so in today's society, the lecturer specifically said that she thinks the individual and society are very different. And perhaps this is products of postmodernity, you know, where there isn't really a common axiom that holds us together. And that was sort of my elaboration on what she was saying. That there isn't really common values within postmodern society. I guess because of social media, we can almost create our own reality. We have much more freedom to be able to do that. To be able to create, I guess, subcultures or just be ourselves and, you know, pick and mix from a whole multitude of different things which I guess could constitute our personal identity. And I've just reminded myself of an interesting theory someone was talking about earlier, which is bundle theory. And I guess bundle theory is the idea that we have different... Our sense of self changes over time. Like we have a bundle and perhaps at one point in our life, in that bundle, it may include going out with friends or listening to music, but then at another point in our life, the bundle changes. Maybe we become more introverted and enjoy spending more time alone and maybe even pick up painting. And that would be in our bundle, and I find that very interesting. But I don't think it's 100% relevant, however it kind of is, because it does sort of represent the modern world. Okay, so let's go back to Plato's Politics and Plato's ideas. So, obviously Greece was a democracy at the time, in ancient Greek. And in this democracy, women weren't allowed to vote. They didn't have any say in the political system in the polis. Children weren't allowed to vote. And slaves weren't allowed to vote. So obviously this leaves behind Athenian men, right? So I guess here you could sort of derive an argument for a feminist philosophy. The idea that, you know, society is inherently patriarchal, that it's built upon a patriarchal structure. And that patriarchal structure extends back to ancient Greece because, you know, all of the foundations of the Western world are predicated in that specific time period. And these Athenian men were the ones who had the say in where society was going, what happened in the state. And that is really interesting, actually, because, you know, I've never really thought about it in that way before. I'm also familiar with this idea that Plato in his Republic, I believe it's in his Republic, I don't know if this ever actually happened, but he said that women shouldn't look after their children. Rather, the state should look after their children. And I guess this goes back to individual and state, or perhaps the state being sovereign over the individual. And maybe this is sort of to enforce that sort of common axiom among the children, to ensure that they're all getting the same upbringing, they're all getting the same education, which would ultimately make them indistinguishable from one another. But it also takes the power away from the parents, and specifically the mother, because I'm assuming that the teachers would be males. Not sure, maybe they would be females, but then it's taken away the purpose and the role of the mother within the society, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. Perhaps it could be good because, you know, some mothers are really bad, and some children grow up, you know, struggling because of that. But then you've also got to assume that the people who were teaching the children in these societies, like we can look at the Catholic Church, for example, and the nunneries from across the years, you know, they were places of education, yet there was a lot of exploitation that went on there. So just because you're teaching children in a big group, you know, all together, perhaps separate to the family, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be better. So that's interesting. Okay, so men were the only ones who were allowed to vote, but not only were they allowed, but they were also encouraged to do so. And if they didn't, then they were known as idiotas, which essentially means people who stay at home, and it's where the term idiots comes from, which we use in today's society. So men have to be dikaiosune, I can't say, dikaiosun, dikaiosuno, in both their private life and their public life. And dikaiosun so means doing the right thing, I guess. I don't know, it's kind of confusing, isn't it? Because there's the translation of the word, and then there's the actual word and the actual meaning, and perhaps sometimes it does get a bit lost in translation. And I've been given an excerpt to read from Plato's Republic, so I'm probably going to do that after this. I've got the actual book up there, so I'm going to check the page numbers I have to read, and I'll just read it from the paper copy, because I get a headache from staring at the screen too long. So, yeah. And then there were some questions I had to think about as well, so I'll also think about those when the time is right after reading. So I think that's everything we covered. So it wasn't really super philosophical, it was more about history, but still nonetheless I did find it interesting. So yeah, thank you for watching.